So I played a little bit of Final Fantasy VII last night, and I am really enjoying it. The original Final Fantasy VII, not the remake, which I'm not even bothering with. And I am starting to feel like the game is extremely overrated, and I think a lot of people will sort of agree with me on that. But this is coming from someone who legitimately does enjoy the game, but I think people are delusional if they say that this is one of the all-time best RPGs, if this is one of the all-time best Final Fantasy games, if this is maybe even one of the all-time best PlayStation games, because definitely one of the best games of that generation, because I can name several N64 games, including Ocarina of Time, Super Mario 64, GoldenEye 64, Conker's Bad Fur Day, Banjo-Kazooie. There are lots of games on N64 that I can tell you are better than this. The N64 the PS1 could never stand up to the N64 in the quality department anyway. It mostly relied on marketing and hyping up its games as being mature games for mature gamers. And that kind of shows a little bit in how so much less popular games like Final Fantasy VIII and IX are compared to Final Fantasy VII, which was of course the over-marketed $100 million marketing budget, not development budget, for the game that was sold to all these people who had never played an RPG before or since. It was Final Fantasy VII legitimately does have compelling characters and a compelling story, and an interesting setting. There are things to enjoy about Final Fantasy VII, right? But I find, coming back to it after getting more into core RPGs, getting into other RPGs, right? Like I've been playing other RPGs, right? I have a history of other RPGs, and I am finding that the game seems to incorporate simultaneously the best of the Nintendo era and the worst of the PlayStation one. So basically what that means is that the story and characters seem to be building off what Squaresoft was doing with the classic Final Fantasy games, in which you have these science fiction characters. You have this science fiction setting, this weird mix of this weird blend of science fiction and fantasy, of swords and guns, of a character drama and save the world plot lines, that sort of thing, right? The core elements that make Final Fantasy, and yet you had the disgusting, despicable elements that have ruined PlayStation games for the past 20 years. A less of a focus on gameplay and more on cinematics and more on story. And this is the philosophy that has ruined gaming as a whole for modern audiences. This game, this and Metal Gear Solid, I would say, are responsible for creating the formula that still exists to this day, in which if you have pretty graphics in pretty cutscenes, people will view those as being the game and will buy and play through a $60 purchase just to experience the game or those cutscenes and those visuals. They don't really care. They don't really have any knowledge of what the game is like, how it plays, or anything. They just want to see those cutscenes. They want to be part of the exciting new release, essentially. And that's a formula that's been held true for Sony for years, and it's only been getting worse with each passing generation, right? Like with Final Fantasy X, we had the linear hallways. We had some voice acting, a big focus on voice acting, less of an emphasis on exploration or really doing anything gameplay wise. It felt like a step down in a lot of ways, gameplay-wise, from other Final Fantasies. But a lot of people didn't care because the story feels like it's been expanded a lot. And now, with Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 15, Kingdom Hearts 3, Final Fantasy 7R, we're reaching the point where it feels like with every single release, the games keep getting lazier, more uninspired, more padded, and they try to shove cutscenes into literally everything. Like, I am baffled watching Final Fantasy VII R and seeing how many times the cutscenes go on for like 10, 15 minutes at a time for stuff that was like blazed through in the original, right? Final Fantasy VII R like completely failed to really remake the original in a faithful capacity. It is very, very, very frustrating to see people sort of, for one thing, not acknowledge that Final Fantasy VII R is not a good remake. It's not a good game. It's not interesting. There's nothing about it that really makes it worth playing if you're a fan of the original. And not really acknowledging that the original Final Fantasy VII did have flaws. I never said that Final Fantasy VII was a flawless game. Like, personally, when I said it was one of my favorites, I was speaking in general terms. It's really weird because now that I'm replaying it again, like, I'm really starting to appreciate just how much filler and padding there is, even in the original game. Like, I don't. There are like really good moments in Final Fantasy VII, but there are plenty of times where like you're just wandering around trying to figure out what to do, trying to get from the next set piece to the next set piece. Like, they had not refined the formula that the modern audiences today get, in which you have like markers pointing you to your next objective. You have cutscenes like every couple of feet. You have like no, like there are still like there's still an echo of classic Final Fantasy in there, and it's still engaging enough. You know what I mean? Like, I can say that Final Fantasy VII is boring at parts. There are too many times where like it focuses on characters that don't really matter. Like the Shinra executives. Like, do we really need to focus so much on like the Turks and the actual Shinra executives who don't really contribute much to the plot? Like, all you really need is Rufus and maybe some other people to be antagonists, secondary antagonists, and that's really it. Like, I was baffled, like, playing this game again and like seeing the Turks and trying to remember what they actually do in the game, because I was coming up with blanks. Like, all I remember is that like they all want to bang members of Avalanche, like different members of the group. It's like, okay, really, really interesting, guys. It's so, compared to Final Fantasy VI, it feels like this game sort of took some steps forward and several steps back, particularly in the gameplay department. I'm very, very surprised with how little strategy it takes to actually win fights in this game. Like, 90% of the time, like, all you have to do, hit the fast forward button, hit the attack button, and then just blaze through every fight you get into. Like, most enemies will go down in a couple of hits. Like, super, super easy, right? Bosses, they'll sometimes have, like, one gimmick, but it's usually easily dealt with. Like, oh, use magic. Oh, attack the monster in the back row. Oh, do something very specific that anyone could figure out. Like, I would say Final Fantasy VI wasn't easy, but was easy, but like it wasn't like brain dead the way this almost feels. The way this can feel at time, where I can walk into a battle completely unprepared, right? Where I can have the completely wrong materia build, right? Where I can fight a monster that can only be hit by magic, and I only have one character that uses magic, and my other two characters can't do jack shit, and I still end up winning because the enemy is just not all that powerful or intelligent, and that is Final Fantasy VII. Like, it feels like there are a lot of things that it does right. You know, like the story is legitimately good, but there are also a number of things that it gets wrong. Like, compared to something like Super Mario 64 and Ocarina, and GoldenEye, which defined those genres for generations, a lot of the mechanics and features introduced in Final Fantasy VII disappeared and were never seen again. Like, you know, the camera angles, the sense of humor, like it's so interesting to me how so few people seem to appreciate Final Fantasy VII for what it is as a game. It really does feel like to me that the main reason people are so hyped and so invested in the Final Fantasy VII brand is because they hate Nintendo, and Final Fantasy VII to them is the is a defining example of what it means to defy the big N and to shit all over them. And it does feel like Final Fantasy VII and its popularity mostly revolves around this. Mostly revolving around PlayStation fanboys hating on Nintendo. It doesn't feel as if it's properly being evaluated as a great video game.